There's a reason improvised weapons fascinate historians today. They reveal the raw edge of human adaptation, the moments where necessity outpaced supply lines, and where sheer ingenuity filled the void that factories, governments, or stable front lines couldn't. When you study these handmade tools, you're not just looking at metal hammered into shape. You're staring straight at the psychology of survival, rebellion, and wartime improvisation. And if you've spent enough time in the archives, you already know that some of the most unexpected breakthroughs in resistance warfare came from the simplest piles of discarded metal. For the next few minutes, I want to take you through a tour of 8 historically grounded, scrap metal-based weapons that shaped survival at the margins of Europe's conflicts. No myths, no embellishment, just the real story of how determined individuals turned metal waste into tools that changed local battlefields, one fight at a time. The crude, trench-made stabbing weapons that emerged when factory bayonets ran out. During the First World War, frontline units frequently found themselves short on issued bayonets. In places like Verdun and the Isonzo valleys, repair depots lagged behind demand, and broken equipment piled up faster than it could be replaced. Soldiers resorted to reshaping shattered knife blades, bent entrenching tool fragments, or spare steel rods into stabbing weapons. These were typically single-purpose tools, nothing elegant, just a sharpened length of metal welded or bound to a wooden grip. For historians, the value lies in how these pieces reflect trench combat's brutal intimacy. If you want to understand the mindset of a unit forced into close quarters, these handmade blades tell you everything. Soldiers didn't wait for supply officers, they made what they needed. In a modern survival analysis context, the lesson isn't weapon creation, but adaptability under constrained logistics. You learn how individuals evaluated scraps for structural strength, repurposing only what could withstand pressure and shock. The reforged farm sickles and cutting tools that Balkan fighters leaned on. Across the Balkans, in both world wars, partisans routinely turned agricultural scrap into weapons. The sickle, iconic for farming, became a stopgap cutting and slashing implement when ammunition ran low. Wartime diaries describe resistance groups heating and straightening old sickle blades over makeshift forges, reforging them to suit local needs. What matters for students of history is how these partisan adaptations reflect regional economy. Rural fighters used what villages already owned. For survivalists studying these patterns, a key takeaway is recognizing how communities leverage familiar materials rather than chasing exotic resources. It's about understanding terrain, local craft traditions, and the tools already embedded in daily life. The railway spike conversions used by certain Eastern European resistance groups. Railway systems were strategic arteries across Europe, so abandoned spikes became abundant scrap. Resistance networks in Poland and Ukraine repurposed them into dense, weighty close-quarters implements. Reports from the Armia Krajowa archives describe how the solid, square-shafted steel of a spike could be reshaped into a compact striking tool. The historical insight here is that rail infrastructure gave rebels something armies rarely planned for: consistent, standardized metal fragments scattered across occupied territory. When analyzed today, these converted spikes serve as a reminder of how improvised warfare depends heavily on geography and industrial layout, not just tactical creativity. The welded scrap metal clubs used by British Home Guard units early in the war, well, they really tell a story, don't they? In 1940, before mass weapons production hit full speed, Britain's Home Guard famously trained with improvised items. Some local units welded together heavy scrap, pipe sections, rebar offcuts, broken machine parts to create weighted striking tools used strictly for training and, in the worst case, last resort defence. These pieces reveal just how unprepared Britain initially was, and how civilians, really bridged that dangerous gap. Modern historians examining these artefacts gain a nuanced view of morale. People took responsibility for their own defence, however crude the means. The practical interpretation for enthusiasts today is about resource assessment and historical resilience, not replication. The sheet metal spearheads hammered out by Eastern Front auxiliaries. Now, that's another fascinating example. On the Eastern Front, auxiliary units sometimes fashioned spearheads from roofing metal and miscellaneous steel sheets. Despite their crude form, they served a tactical purpose in perimeter defence and for handling wild animals around camp perimeters, a detail many overlook. These implements demonstrate something important. Improvisation wasn't always for fighting other soldiers. Sometimes it was a response to environmental threats, logistical shortages, or the need for multi-purpose camp equipment. When you study these spearheads today, the insight you gain is about functional creativity under an ecosystem of problems, not a single enemy. The modified metalworking scraps used by resistance saboteurs. Not all improvised tools were weapons in the traditional sense. Sabotage units in France, Norway and the Netherlands often used metal scraps to jam gears, derail simple mechanisms, or disable small engines. These weren't lethal weapons, they were force multipliers. A small piece of bent steel inserted into the right junction box could neutralize an entire patrol's mobility. For serious history enthusiasts, this is where the study of scrap metal improvisation becomes most intellectually rewarding. The takeaway is understanding how resistance groups weaponized disruption rather than confrontation. It's a lesson modern security analysts still reference. The metal band traps used in rural partisan zones. Partisans operating in forests and mountains sometimes repurposed old barrel hoops, wagon bands or iron straps into defensive perimeter traps. Again, these were not offensive weapons, but emergency security tools intended to alert, delay or discourage intruders. This category shows how improvisation often served a strategic function, shaping the battlefield environment itself, instead of creating something meant to be wielded hand to hand. The scrap metal reinforcements added to shields and defensive boards. Improvised armour receives far less attention, but in several conflicts, especially within militias, fighters nailed or bolted layers of scrap metal onto wooden boards to form crude defensive shields used in riots, ambushes or blockades. These weren't elegant, but they changed survivability. The historical value lies in showing how communities protected themselves with whatever industrial remnants they could gather. For today's historian, the lesson is about analysing defensive ingenuity rather than purely offensive creation. If this deep dive into scrap metal ingenuity taught you something new, make sure you subscribe to Warpaths of Europe. Share this with fellow historians, researchers, or anyone who appreciates the hidden layers of Europe's conflicts. The more we explore these overlooked details, the clearer the past becomes, and the better we understand the people who fought, survived, and adapted through it.